Good morning. So yesterday we learned the Mishnah, and the Mishnah, second half of the Mishnah we learned, which read that in every generation a person is supposed to see themselves as if they left Egypt, which is why you tell your child, this is what happened to me. And then we learned, and therefore we ought to laud, praise, etc., etc. And we begin with half of Hallel, and the dispute is how much of Hallel is to be read before eating a matzah, a Shammai and Hillel, which by the way, the Rebbe has a talk on that as well. We spoke about this in the past. How the Rebbe understands that all disputes between Shammai and Hillel based on the Rav each other, that Beis Hillel rules that we follow what you actually have in hand, whereas Shammai rules based on what you have in potential. And Rebbe frames the argument between Shammai and Hillel about how much the Hallel you have in that context as well. People do that another time. And then the Haggadah went to talk. Then the Mishnah went to talk about how you conclude the bracha. The big statement, as I mentioned yesterday, there's in each and every generation, a person is supposed to see themselves as if they left Egypt. That is a statement from the Mishnah. It doesn't say in the Mishnah you shall read this. It just says it as a fact. You're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt. And I noted the fact that many halachas are derived from that statement. We actually learned that. We learned Tafai and Beis, chapter 472 in the Alter Shulchan Aruch, where we discussed the person has to set up his house with pillows and blankets and put all the fancy stuff on the table. All of that is in fulfillment of this Mishnah's instructions to see yourself as if you left Egypt. So therefore, you have to demonstrate opulence. Along with fulfilling the injunction to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, we also actually make that statement. We say so. We read that paragraph in the Haggadah itself. So we're looking at here. We'll see how far we go. We'll see if we maybe skip some parts. But it's an in-depth talk from the Rebbe, an essay from the Rebbe, on this statement, halachic insight, on this statement of in every generation, the person is supposed to see himself as if he left Egypt. We spoke about the Hasidic interpretation yesterday briefly. Here is a halachic analysis based on Rambam and that chapter in the Shulchan Aruch that we learned from the Alter Rebbe in chapter 472, which we learned a while back. We learned the laws of leaning. Right? When we learned the laws of leaning, the statement came up. Part of the leaning is to demonstrate freedom, that we are free. Okay, so let's begin then. Kosav HaRambam. Rambam writes, V'zel Lashonai, and we are quoting now. B'chol dar v'dar, in every generation, Chayav Adam, a person is obligated, and listen to the words carefully and tell me where there's a difference from our Mishnah. Laharos es atzmai, to demonstrate himself, Hilu ba'atzmai yotza ata mishibid mitzrayim, as if he himself went out now from the bondage of Egypt. So there's a few differences, and everybody's going to point them out. If you look at our Mishnah, you have it, design of the Mishnah there, 116b. Just look at the words in Hebrew after the parentheses. The second parentheses, which has the 3, there's aleph there. It says b'chol dar v'dar, in every generation. Chayav adam liros es atzmai, the person is supposed to view himself kilu yotzim min Mitzrayim, as if he went out of Egypt. Rambam, do side by side comparison. B'chol dar v'dar chayav adam laharos es atzmai. In each and every generation, a person is supposed to demonstrate himself. Different terminology in the Mishnah. Mishnah said to see himself. Rambam says to demonstrate himself. Exactly. That's right. As well, other differences. The Rambam adds the words Mishibud Mitzrayim, from the subjugation of Egypt, rather than Mitzrayim, just from Egypt. As well, I think the word Ata is the word Ata now in the Mishnah. Kilu ba'atzma yotza Ata. No, Mishnah just says Kilu yotza Mitzrayim, as if he went out of Egypt. Whereas Rambam says as if he went out now from Egypt. Meaning from the Mishnah itself, you might say the person could see himself as if he left out of Egypt last year or earlier in his life. Whereas Rambam is writing, you have to see yourself as if you left out of Egypt now, or demonstrate yourself as if you left now. We have to understand. Exactly. And we're going to see the Alter Rebbe has a third variant. So Mishnah, Rambam of the Rebbe. Okay, the parentheses. Okay, we'll skip the parentheses for now.
We're reading from that
Back to the Rebbe's commentary. Yeah, so we'll go to the second paragraph and skip the parentheses because we're going to revisit it later in the talk. Okay. Nini Mokar Dinzeh. Now this source for this law, etc., that in every generation a person's obligated, etc., who is Kamoshi Mitzayim the Maggid Mishnah, as the Maggid Mishnah, the classic commentary on the Rambam, points out, that the source is Ma Mishnah Psachim, from the Mishnah in Psachim, our Mishnah, which we learned. It's sort of the following requires explanation, what we just noted. Nusach Mishnah, the text of the Mishnah, Lafia Gersa Shlefanenu, based on the version that we have. This is also the variant of the text as it appears in Rambam's own handwriting of the Mishnah. Let's explain. Right? Earlier in his life, sorry, one second. We've spoken about this in the past. Earlier in his life, Rambam wrote a commentary to the Mishnah. So he also wrote out the Mishnah itself, on which he's going to comment. So we look at the text as he has it in his handwriting, in his commentary on the Mishnah, and it matches our text. Meaning, just like we learned about the 4 questions in the Rebbe's commentary in the Haggadah, they would conclude that Rambam must have had a different variant of the text. You might say the same here, and all the questions are out. Right now, the differences in the text as it appears in Rambam, or as it appears in our Mishnah, will be out the window if we found a text that actually matched Rambam's version. But because Rambam's text himself, the way he himself wrote the Mishnah, matches the version that we have, we can ask the following questions of why Rambam changes from the way our Mishnah writes it. Right, follow that?
Yeah.
So the text there reads, "Who Chayav Adam Lirois." Person is supposed to see himself, etc. Whereas Rambam writes, a person is obligated to demonstrate himself, laharos. So v'harezeh, now this statement, like you mentioned,
sorry.
Yeah.
Can you just go back? Yeah. Why do you say they're the same? Rambam's text is the same as ours when
no, his text of the Mishnah, right? He wrote a commentary to the Mishnah earlier in his life, and in that commentary, he actually writes out the Mishnah itself.
With the words like as
That's right. So the way he writes out the Mishnah, his commentary to the Mishnah, matches the Mishnah as we have it, rather than the way he phrases it in his book of laws.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
In other words, that solidifies the fact that there's room for a question. Because if Rambam had a different text in the Mishnah,
back to the text that
correct,
he cites himself.
correct, elsewhere, right? But the point is that's the variant he had. It's not as if he had a different variant of a text.
So the question is why would it change?
That's right, correct. So this change between to see oneself versus to demonstrate oneself isn't just a wording issue. It's a content issue also, and even a halachic difference, like you were saying, as I was about to say. The difference in the text is also different in actual law. Rambam's language is chayav adam laharis. A person is meant to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt. The meaning of that statement is it's not enough that the person sees himself internally as if he himself left Egypt. You're also obligated to demonstrate it to others. The Mishnah makes no reference to the fact that you have to demonstrate to others that you're free. The Mishnah just says, view yourself that way. Okay, so internally I see myself as if I left Egypt. Using the spiritual meditation we talked about yesterday. I don't know, let's say, whatever it is. The point is, he internally sees himself that way, and then he can tell his child, this happened to me, because I see it that way for myself. Whereas Rambam adds by saying, you have to demonstrate that you left Egypt. That means how you view yourself, irrelevant. The point is to behave in such a manner that others looking at you would say, oh, this guy's free. Right? So the change in language is also a change in the halacha. Mm-hmm. So of course begs the question, where did Rambam get this halacha from? Not in our Mishnah.
Can you look at this out? Can you look at the steps leading up to the halacha of leaning?
Okay, we'll see. Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to discuss that, yeah. There was setting us up for that, yes. Okay, top of the left column. And the following is even more not understood. The Lachoda seemingly Divri Rambam Atzmoi, the Rambam's words himself, seem to contradict themselves. How so? The Nusach HaHaggadah Shaloi, in the Rambam's text of the Haggadah, in his book of laws, in the halachas of the Seder night, he includes the halachas of what you're supposed to do that night. And then he actually includes the text of the Haggadah. And he puts the words B'chol Devar in the text of the Haggadah. Yes, Rambam includes the text of the Haggadah. Okay. In his book of laws. At the end of Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah. So go to the text of his Haggadah, and what does he write? The Nusach Haggadah Shaloi. In Rambam's own text of the Haggadah, what does he write? Kaisiv, he writes, B'chol Devar Chayv Adam Lirois et Atzmai. In every generation, a person is supposed to see himself. So in this text of the Haggadah, he keeps it consistent with the Mishnah, see yourself. But with respect to the laws of how you're supposed to behave that night, he writes, the person is supposed to demonstrate himself. They're both in the book of Halacha, and they're like 2 pages apart.
Oh, right.
But that's right, the text of the Haggadah appears in his book of law. So in his book of law, where he describes how to behave that night, he says every generation, this person is supposed to demonstrate himself. But then in his text of the Haggadah, he writes, in every generation, this person is supposed to see himself. Sorry?
It's like optimally demonstrate.
Okay, so obviously there's 2 different things going on here. One is the halachas of behavior, and one is the halachas of how you're supposed to see yourself. And both are true, and we'll have to discuss all of that. Okay, so this is the questions. But at this point, it seems like a contradiction. Are you supposed to see yourself, or are you supposed to demonstrate yourself? Rambam seems to be saying both.
Seeming contradiction.
Yeah. Second paragraph on the left. The same question. The same question is in the Alter Rebbe, which we learned, chapter 472 in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which we learned the laws of leaning, the laws of drinking the 4 cups of wine. So there he says. No, sorry. So the same question applies. Because Nusach HaGadah Shaloi V'chein Betanya, the Alter Rebbe also wrote a book of law and also wrote a Siddur. And the Siddur includes the Haggadah. So in his Haggadah, in his Siddur, Kaisiv, the Rambam Alter Rebbe writes, Chayv Adam Lirois, a person is supposed to see himself. But in his book of law, Kaisiv Chayv Adam Laharis, the person is supposed obligated to demonstrate himself. Okay, so it seemed
that he did the same thing.
He did the same thing. So the Alter Rebbe source is obviously Rambam. Because Rambam has both. In his text of the Haggadah, Lirois, to see oneself, and in his book of law, and in his instruction manual for that night, writes Laharis, to demonstrate oneself. And Alter Rebbe does the same thing. The Alter Rebbe only it's in 2 different books rather than 1 book.
I thought it was the other way around. I thought in his Haggadah he was to see himself.
That's right. What did I say? I said the other way around?
I thought you said demonstrate. In
his book of law. In his instructions for how he's supposed to behave that night.
Not the Haggadah.
Not the Haggadah itself.
Okay, not the Haggadah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Alter Rebbe follows the same. Right? Because they're both in his book of law. In Rambam's book of law, one is the text of the Haggadah, and one is the instructions to that night. So in his instruction says demonstrate. In his Haggadah, which is also in his book of law, it says see oneself. Now Alter Rebbe does the same pattern, but for the Alter Rebbe, it's in 2 different books. One is in his book of law. There it says demonstrate oneself, and then in his Siddur, which includes Haggadah, he writes see oneself. So however you resolve the question in Rambam, that same resolution will apply to Alter Rebbe, who seems to be basing himself on Rambam. Right? Okay, Bays.
But unlike Rambam, Alter Rebbe included there's included commentary and sourcing, right?
Alter Rebbe included sourcing mostly, yeah. Yeah, nothing here that would solve the issue. Yeah. Otherwise, the Rebbe would cite to it. Yeah. Okay, Bays. Left side, Bays. Oit shinne b'loshen Rambam. Another distinction in the language of Rambam, the Admor Zaken and the Alter Rebbe, who's consistent with Rambam so far, Miloshen HaMishnah, another difference between Rambam Alter Rebbe in their set of laws and the Mishnah, the Haggadah Shalem and their Haggadahs, right? The Haggadah and the Mishnah are consistent. Alter Rebbe, Rambam's Haggadah and Mishnah is all consistent, whereas Rambam and Alter Rebbe in their halacha is different. So here's another distinction here. So one is see oneself, demonstrate oneself. Though that's one distinction. Yeah. Here's another one. The Mishnah of Haggadah, in the Mishnah and in the Haggadah, Isa, the language is as if he left out of Egypt. V'loshen haRambam v'admor zaken he. Whereas Rambam and Alter Rebbe write, Ki'ilu ba'atzmo yotza ato mishiv Mitzrayim. So first of all, there's the now. There's the as if he, not just he, but he himself. But the word, what we're going to add, what we're focusing on now is the fact that the Rambam and Alter Rebbe add from the bondage of Egypt, rather than the Mishnah which said as if you left Egypt.
Subjugation. Right?
The bondage from the subjugation. Whereas the Mishnah doesn't say that. Mishnah just says as if you left Egypt. Whereas the Rambam and Alter Rebbe add as if you left the bondage of Egypt.
And that's where in the book of Halachas.
Yes. So now, before the Rebbe addresses that, first the Rebbe addresses the other ones, which is the now and the see him himself, Uba he himself. So let's first address that. The added words of himself, he himself, and the word now, even though it's a change, but it's not a change that changes the fundamental of the meaning of the text. It's only added emphasis.
It's almost like interpretive.
It's interpretive of the same message. The concept of the Mishnah is to see yourself as if you left Egypt. So they add to see you yourself as if you left now Egypt. So it's more emphasis.
Yeah, it's more qualitative.
Right. It's only added emphasis in the words as if you left Egypt. The meaning is interpretive, like you just said, as if he himself went out now. It's extrapolative, explanative, but it doesn't change the main the message.
It's not an alteration.
Not an alteration in the meaning. Just emphasis in the meaning.
It's an elaboration.
Elaboration. Elaboration. Emphasis, elaboration. Whereas the change of see yourself versus demonstrate is a change in actual halacha.
Yeah.
Change in
meaning.
Right. Okay. So in those two changes is emphasis. Now, so why don't they add this extrapolative, interpretive emphasis in their text of the Haggadah? Right, because those two extra words, he himself and the word now, only appears in the book of Halacha, not in their Haggadahs. So why not put it in the Haggadahs also? He says, Ki yapiska b'chol devader, because the paragraph b'chol devader in every generation that's in the Haggadah, he had talked lashon the Mishnah. It's just we're just quoting the Mishnah. Our entire Mishnah, which says in every generation supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt, and then which says, and therefore you're supposed to laud and praise and thank and glorify and exalt. That entire Mishnah is lifted and transported and put into the Haggadah. So when you're lifting and transporting the text, you don't add anything. But when you're quoting it in halacha, you can add an emphasis. Okay. But you can't change the message. And there's where his question is. In other words, the fact that they added emphasis in their book of halacha doesn't bother the Rebbe. But the fact that they changed the meaning, that the Rebbe is questioning. This is the question the Rebbe is addressing. Follow?
Yeah.
So question number one was see yourself versus demonstrate. Question number two is the added word as if you left the bondage of Egypt rather than as if you left Egypt.
The Haggadah says seeing or demonstrating? I just want to remember.
Haggadah says see, like a Mishnah.
So it's similar here as well.
Yes.
Just transplanting.
Just transplant the text.
Right into the Haggadah.
Correct. But when you change the content of that message in your halacha, there becomes a question. If you emphasize more, if in your book of halacha, you add explanation to the Mishnah, good. When you change the message of the Mishnah, now we have a problem.
Okay,
so when you add emphasis in the
Haggadah is okay, it's still intact with the Mishnah.
The Haggadah is intact with the Mishnah.
Now we have to question why the halacha is
correct.
It has been altered.
Correct.
Without explanation.
Correct. So when the halacha is altered to add emphasis, good. So you're saying he himself, good. You're saying see yourself now, good. When you change the message from see yourself to demonstrate, we have an issue.
Unless
like
you can explain it.
Which we will, obviously. That's what we're going to do. Yeah. Okay, so now the second question is, top page 40. And the fact that Rambam and Alter Rebbe add, not just left Egypt, but left the bondage of Egypt. So this requires explanation. How so?
Because that's not an emphasis, right?
That's right. The language of the Mishnah, which says you have to see yourself as if you left Egypt, mashma usa. The meaning here is that you're supposed to see yourself as if you left the land of Egypt. What were you doing in Egypt makes a difference. The land of Egypt, a foreign land. Even if you're not in bondage, you're still in exile. I'm not in bondage in Canada right now. I'm still waiting for divine redemption when we're going to return to Israel and rebuild our temple. Right? So leaving Egypt without bondage is itself a message. Right? Masha'enking shibud mitzrayim. But when the halacha adds, Rambam and Alter Rebbe, that now we're looking to see yourself as if you left the bondage of Egypt, it's possible, and there were even times when we were in bondage out of Egypt. So if the emphasis is bondage, then if I'm in bondage in Inquisition Spain, right? I'm still in bondage. Not in Egypt, but I'm still in bondage. So what's the emphasis? Is the emphasis I have to see myself as if in a bondage, which happened to have been in Egypt. But if the emphasis is to get out of bondage, then that transcends geography. But if the emphasis is left Egypt, I'm out of Egypt. I left Egypt. That slave, that exile's over. But bondage may not. Furthermore, there puts in the footnote here. Maybe this is more correct. The bondage of Egypt could have extended outside of Egypt too. Because Pharaoh was a superpower, which had other nations in his dominion too. So the Jews could have been in bondage even out of Egypt, in theory.
Philistines.
There were countries that were under his rule, and they were subject to slavery too. So the bondage could have actually been out of Egypt too. If the point is the bondage, then leaving Egypt is not enough. But if the point is leaving Egypt, then leaving Egypt is enough. So the Rebbe is highlighting it may not be as stark as the see yourself versus demonstrate. Why is it not as stark? Because the see yourself versus demonstrate yourself has halachic difference. Whereas see yourself as if you left the bondage of Egypt versus see yourself as if you left Egypt doesn't have any halachic difference. But still, in messaging, it has a difference. Is the emphasis that we're in a foreign land, or is the emphasis that we're in bondage? What's the emphasis? Because bondage could be in different lands. Okay. A little bit more? Okay. Gimel. The Rambam writes, B'chol Davidar in every generation, etc. See yourself, Mishibud Mitzrayim, as if you left the bondage of Egypt. Okay. Misayim Vizal. Rambam concludes with the following words. Rambam brings a proof text for this idea that you have to see yourself as if you left Egypt. But, surprise, surprise, the proof text that Rambam brings is not the same proof text as our Mishnah. Okay? So what's the Rambam's proof text?
We go back to that earlier saying that he must have had another.
Well, that you would have thought so, but for the fact that so you would have thought that the Rambam had a different variant in the Mishnah, but for the fact that he himself wrote a commentary in the Mishnah in which he maintained our version. Okay. So what's the Rambam's proof text from Scripture? Shenemar, the verse reads, "You took us out of Egypt," says the verse, and Rambam concludes, "And of this God commanded us in Torah. You shall remember, says the Torah, Ki eved hayisa, you were a slave. Remember, you were a slave, says the verse. Says Rambam, Kloimar, meaning to say, Kilo ata ba'atzmacha hayisa eved, as if you yourself were a slave. The Yotza Lacheres V'nifta said you went out of Egypt to freedom and you were redeemed. End quote from Rambam.
I would support the argument that he is of the opinion that the subjugation is about subjugation of Egypt.
Well, subjugation particular.
Egypt alone.
Well, subjugation specifically.
But not.
Remember
other subjugation.
Yes, actually, on the contrary, right. Rambam doesn't even mention the word Mitzrayim. Look at the text.
I thought you mentioned it.
No, did I? Yeah. Okay, let's read it again. You see where the quotation is? Shenemar, the third line after Gimel.
Yeah.
Shenemar as it reads. This is a quote from Rambam. Shenemar as it reads, "Vaisanu ha'itz misham." You took us out of there. The word Egypt. Okay, that's maybe I said Egypt. It doesn't say Egypt. But you took us out of there. This is his proof that you have to see yourself as if you left this bondage of Egypt, because Oisano is us. Us, you took out of there. Misham. And of this, God commands the Torah in his Torah, you should remember you were a slave. Doesn't say where. Remember you were a slave. I mean to say, as if you yourself were a slave. Doesn't say where. And you went out, to freedom, and if they said redeemed. Egypt not mentioned. Only remember you were a slave. That's highlighted. See?
Yeah.
Okay, so now 3 questions from the Rebbe on this statement, and then we'll leave the rest for Monday. Number 1, Haraya b'Mishnah. The Mishnah's proof text, based on the text that we have, al b'chol devadur. The proof text of the Mishnah for the statement that in every generation you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt, he is, quote, Shenemar, as the verse reads, you should tell your child on that day, Lamar saying, the proof text of the Mishnah is the verse which reads, you shall tell your child on that day, because of this God did to me when he took me out of Egypt. That's the Mishnah's proof you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Because Torah commands that you tell your child that I left Egypt. That's not the same proof text as Rambam, which says, you're supposed to quote the verse which says, and God did this to us. Remember, you were a slave. Those verses are not in the Mishnah. So why the Rambam picking a different verse? It's question 1. Now, let's go back. Remember, we said before that we have scripture, we have the handwriting from Rambam in which he writes out the Mishnah, right? So let's look at that text. What does it say there? It says Rebbe, even though the Mishnah that appears in the Rambam's own handwriting on his commentary of the Mishnah written many years earlier, which we mentioned above, and likewise in Rambam's transplanted quotation of the Mishnah into his Haggadah, right? No proof text is cited. Right? Okay, so maybe the question isn't so big. If Rambam had a Mishnah which had one proof text and he quoted a different one, serious question. Right? But Rambam's Mishnah text doesn't have any proof text. So maybe that's why he can choose whichever proof text he wants. Right? Because he doesn't have any precedent of a Mishnah choosing a certain verse, so he can choose whichever verse he wants. Following?
I thought the Mishnah had a.
The Mishnah as we have it.
Earlier that Rambam's not citing the same verse as the Mishnah.
That's right. Rambam's not citing the same verse as the Mishnah that we have. But Rambam's Mishnah doesn't have any verse at all. The text of the Mishnah, as it appears in Rambam, doesn't have any text at all.
So he left that part out.
Well, his text of the Mishnah didn't have any verse.
But ours does.
Ours does. Okay, so if Rambam
didn't write the full version of our Mishnah.
Either that, or he had a text which didn't have a proof text. Or he had a text in the Mishnah which didn't have a verse. Just possible. Which means because Rambam's Mishnah didn't have any verse, he could choose whichever one he wants as proof. Right?
Okay.
And
but is it inconsistent?
Well, it's not inconsistent because there is no, again.
In other words, if you're using a different verse.
Yeah.
I mean.
But different from what? It's different from the verses we have in our Mishnah. But if he didn't have the same Mishnah as us, and his Mishnah didn't have any verses at all, then he's free to choose whichever one he wants.
Right, just like any argument that you see on a Mishnah in the Gemara, that sages that will quote different verses.
Correct. So long as the Mishnah didn't quote a verse. So long as the Mishnah didn't quote a verse, the sages are free to quote any verse they want to support it. Right? Okay. So the question is not so strong because it's not a contradiction to the text that he had.
Right.
Nonetheless, nonetheless, they must ask the following requires explanation. Yeah.
But we have to make an assumption here that he didn't have that other.
That's right.
Verse.
Correct. We're assuming that because if he did, then it would be a serious contradiction.
Right.
Right. But we're assuming he didn't have that. But nonetheless, there still wants to. There was asking for deeper explanation.
Okay. Namely,
nonetheless, we still need to ask the following question. What's the Rambam's reason? That is proof text for this law that you have to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Why did he choose the verses that he did, which is that we and you and us, you took out of there? In other words, even if it doesn't contradict the Mishnah's choice of text, because in his text, the Mishnah didn't choose any verse, nonetheless, he had the option to choose any verse he wants. So why did he select the one he did and not the one that our Mishnah has? Even if it doesn't contradict the Mishnah, because his Mishnah doesn't have any verse, we still should explain why he chose one over the other, because he had the whole text of the Torah that he had, right? Yeah. So he could have chosen any verse in the Torah.
Why did he choose the one the Mishnah?
Why didn't he choose the one the Mishnah did? Even it's not a contradiction, because he didn't have any text in his Mishnah. But he could have chosen that one, because it makes the same point. Right? Okay, question 1. Question 2. Why isn't it enough to quote that original verse he quoted, which is, and you took us out of there, and he adds, but he keeps on adding and says, and of this God commanded in his Torah, you shall remember you were a slave, as if to say you yourself were a slave. Why add that whole part? We already said, in every generation you're supposed to see yourself as if you left the bondage of Egypt. Because the verse says, you took us out of there. Done. But then he adds, no, and of this Torah commands, remember you were a slave. Why did you have to add that second verse with the whole second explanation? That's his question. What do you want to say?
They didn't say bondage.
Remember you were a slave.
Yeah.
Who didn't say bondage?
Mishnah, right?
No. So we're seeing a pattern here, right?
Yeah.
Rambam is focusing on bondage, and the verses he quotes are focusing on bondage.
On him and now.
Him and now, as if you were a slave. That's right. So they're asking these questions to push us in that direction, as if Rambam is making something new that's not in the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah's focus is on, this is what God did to me, he took me out of Egypt. Whereas in Rambam, Egypt is not mentioned at all. It's, you were a slave. But they're asking these questions, kind of pushing that, cajole us in that direction. But we need to get some explanation as to where Rambam got this from and how we came to this conclusion if it's not in the Mishnah. Right? That's what we're going to have to go to. Okay, so that was question number 2. Why did Rambam have to cite to a second verse? Why wasn't there not the first one? Question 3, and we'll conclude with that. Gimel, number 3, on the left-hand side of page 40. Halacha b'chol devar derech chulu. This halacha which says in every generation you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Shebe Rambam Shom, which is in the Rambam there, he is kechol halacha shel perek zeh, like all other halachas of that chapter. It's chapter 8 of the book of the laws of the night of the Seder. That entire chapter discusses, chapter 7 and 8, discuss the laws of the night of the 15th of Nisan, which is the night of the Seder. So this halacha, in every generation you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt, is also relevant to the night of the Seder. And as indeed Rambam writes, therefore, and therefore, because you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt, when you feast tonight, make sure you're leaning, make sure, etc., etc. Right? So emphasizing the fact that the halacha to see yourself as if you left Egypt is relevant to the night of the Seder. That's the context of these halachas. Yeah? This begs the question, man, and moving the following is understood. Hatzivoy, the Torah's command, the verse that Rambam quotes, the second verse he quotes, which is, remember that you were a slave, and therefore see yourself as if you were a slave and you went out of Egypt, and not Egypt, and you were taken to freedom and redeemed. That verse, is not associated with any specific time of the year. In fact, this verse, which says, remember you were a slave, is actually associated with completely other laws. It's one of the reasons why you have Shabbos. Remember you were a slave, so you need rest. It's the reasons for why when you set a slave free, you got to give him lots of gifts, because remember, you were a slave. So Rambam is quoting a verse which describes laws that are universal year-round to make the point that in the night of the Seder, you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Why would you do that? The verse in our Mishnah, which says that tell your son that this happened to me, that verse is talking about that night. That would have been a much better verse to make the point that tonight you have to demonstrate freedom. Instead of quoting a verse which describes in general you're supposed to remember you're a slave, and therefore there are other laws of how you treat slaves because remember you were a slave. Right? Follow his question?
Yeah, why is he using the universal source
instead of the source of that night.
The one that's specifically
That's right.
in the Mishnah that's meant for
Correct.
the.
So that's right. So remember, you're a slave is universal. But the obligation to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt now, tonight, specifically to the night of the Seder. So lots of questions on Rambam, which all point to where did Rambam get this idea, which seems to be a different halacha than the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, see yourself as if you left Egypt because you tell your child it happened to me. And Rambam seems to be emphasizing, demonstrate the fact that you were subject, because remember you were a slave, emphasizing that idea, rather than Hashem took me out of Egypt to tell the story. So what's going on? What undergirds Rambam's use of this halacha, use of what seems to be coming from our Mishnah, but completely different from our Mishnah.
Putting it in the laws of.
That's right. And on Monday, we'll see soon, before the biggest explanation, we're going to see how the Alter Rebbe is based on Rambam, but slightly different. But we already saw that the Alter Rebbe is based on Rambam, because they both say demonstrate rather than see. So Rambam, Alter Rebbe is obviously taking that from Rambam, but we'll see a few differences in Alter Rebbe that's not in Rambam, and we'll get to more explanations on that. This is coming on Monday. My plan is hopefully to finish this before I go to Israel on Wednesday. I'll recap it all, don't worry. The salient points will be recapped. Okay, have a good day, good job, everybody.